why were we not prepared? We knew that maybe this could be part of the future. There are pretty much no women around the table and nobody to speak our minds and our voices.
The phenomenon of modern Haredi society, which is the complete isolation from the rest of Israel, effectively an enemy nation, and therefore soldiers and police officers are the agents of that enemy nation. It's more of a horrifying scene for us to watch.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. I'm your host, Jacob Laznik. This week, a mob of Haredi men chased and attacked two female IDF officers out of Bnei Brak, which was met by lackluster responses from both the Haredi leadership and the Israeli government. Separately, former Hamas hostage Arbel Yehoud recounted in an interview with N12 her experiences in Hamas captivity. She bravely detailed the horrific sexual abuse and violence that she underwent in her captivity, but also noted how, despite after 2 years of war, there are still gaps in the support and relief that the government is providing to former hostages and similar victims of similar crimes. What we're seeing is that while the government is trying to figure out how to square the circle of the status of the Haredi in Israel, the status of the Israeli woman is being put off to the side. To take a closer look at these incidents and discuss this further, we're joined by Tal Hochman, the executive director of the Israel Women's Network. Tal, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So for starters, can you kind of introduce yourself in the work that you do?
So I'm Tal Hochman. I'm the executive director of Israel Women's Network. It's an NGO. In Hebrew, it's called Shdulat Hanashim B'Yisrael. It's an NGO that has been working towards promoting women's rights in Israel for the past 40 years. So we have an advocacy department that we work and legislate laws. We have a legal department where we appeal to the High Supreme Court of Justice, and a media and spokesperson where we raise awareness on women's rights. Incredible.
So there's been a few events over the past week or so in the news that bring up the topic of women's rights. So we're glad to have you here. The story that really made a lot of news that I think everyone talked about, obviously there's a mob of Haredim who attacked female soldiers in Bnei Brak. Mm-hmm. I'd love to hear from you from on the perspective of women, not just these incidents, these attacks, but integrating Haredim and this issue of complete separation of women. How does this affect women, female soldiers?
So I have to start from a personal note.
Sure.
These soldiers did the same position that I did a few years ago in the army, which is the training of boot camp of soldiers who come from difficult backgrounds. So it's a longer tironut boot camp where the female soldiers, the commanders, give so much of their energy and time. They are so invested in these soldiers that this is all they think about. This is all they dream about during that time. And part of this boot camp is that they go to the soldiers' homes and they meet the family because they know how everything is connected. Mm-hmm. The ability of this soldier to succeed later in the army is connected entirely with the way that his family in the house is looking and is viewing the army and everything around him in general.
Right.
So just my heart just went out for these soldiers who just did their job, what they were supposed to do, and went and thought about the soldier. And on the other side of the equation were, as you said, a mob of men who just tried to attack them. And I think this really represents a much bigger problem of how we as women are doing what we're told, are doing what we're supposed to do, are drafting to the army, doing reserve. One of every 5 soldiers, combat soldiers, is a woman. Mm-hmm. So we're doing everything, and then comes this enlistment law, and the Haredi are debating, have this political debate of what they're negotiating to be part of this army. And part of the negotiation is saying we don't want to see women. We don't want to be in bases that women are part of. And this affects everything because the army is the first step, the path towards socialization in Israel in general. So the way that I will be, the position that I will be promoted in the IDF will affect the way that I will be either a political leader or someone in management in an employment market. It could be either. And the way that we are being just pushed to the side, either in Bnei Brak and either in the army, is just a preview to what will happen if we'll agree to that.
This is completely anecdotally, but it sounds to me just from anything I hear that there's basically an understanding that Haredim have to draft in order to answer the IDF's needs of manpower.
Mhm.
And it sounds like it's a given that they will only accept a pathway that fits their way of life. And any discussion revolving this kind of goes into like these little details about sanctions, no sanctions, this, that, driver's licenses, etc. And it sounds like the idea of like separation of women entirely is kind of already agreed upon, already a given. It's like not even thought about. Do you think that there's any way in which Haredim would be drafted that wouldn't involve this clause, or there's absolutely no way that would happen?
I think the question is who is on the other side of the negotiation table. And when we talk to the people from the IDF, the officers and commanders, they tell us women in the army is not a question.
Yeah.
As I said, 1 of every 5 combat soldiers is a woman. We need women. This is unnegotiable.
I'd also like to remind that on October 7th, female combat soldiers, they essentially saved the South. They prevented Hamas from going into like further into Ashdod, Netivot, Sderot, like all those places.
Exactly.
They showed up when we needed them.
Not even talking about the watchers who were
of
there
course.
to begin with and said that there's a problem and nobody listened to them.
Yeah.
So yeah, we have to have women soldiers. It's not a question. I obviously come from it from an equal point of view. But the thing is that we are in a tough position as a society that we need the manpower.
Yeah.
So we don't think that there is a possibility that it is accepted that women will be pushed aside. We understand kashrut, we understand everything. This doesn't affect us as women. And if this is part of their negotiation and who will be the commanders, etc. But the idea of pushing women to the side is unacceptable as pushing people of color to the side and pushing people from other minorities. So why is it when it's women, it's more like okay, and we feel better, or we feel much better about it?
I look at the kind of the responses around the incident that come from the government, and I feel like that consensus isn't exactly shared. You look at the comments that, some, members of the government said, like Tali Gottlieb saying, why did they send women to do their job? As in, maybe in the future, even if that wasn't a woman's role, like that's their job now. So of course you would send them. So I would think do you think as a majority, at least the government shares that sentiment that the IDF needs women, or is that something that from like a state level, they're willing to bargain for other reasons?
Unfortunately, we see that the government is actually pretty much selling women's rights to preserve the coalition. We see it in this specific topic, but we also see it in the legislation that passed another step yesterday of expanding the rabbinical court's mandate.
Right, yeah.
And we see that women's rights is not a priority on their list, and they're willing to sell it to preserve their seats, to do whatever they can to hold power.
If you could, I kind of just like sum up, what do you think are the most heavy, egregious kinds of like expansions of responsibilities and powers that were granted by this bill? What worries you the most? And what are NGOs like you trying to do about it? So
it pretty much says that any case that you once took to regular courts, civilian court, then you could be taken to the rabbinical courts. So either if it's my employer who doesn't see eye to eye with the way that I work, or he wants to fire me, or he put a clause in my contract that everything will be decided in the rabbinical court because either he's religious or whatever. It could be my landlord, it could be my neighbor who we fight on like a communal space. It could be anyone who can take me to the rabbinical court, and I will receive something that looks like a warrant. It looks like an official letter from the government, from the state of Israel. For the common person, it would not look like something that I can say, I'm not willing to be to this discussion in the rabbinical court. I wanted to be in the civilian court.
Right.
So this is one thing. The second thing is that there's a lot of pressure on Haredi women, and we know it firsthand, that they are in a less position of saying, no, we're not willing to negotiate this in the rabbinical court. There was a huge case, a class action that we represented of 2,200 Haredi women who worked in a educational center, that they didn't receive their very basic social rights. They were very afraid to be the women who were in front of this story. So we had to step in. And when we stepped in, they felt more comfortable to be part of the story. But the pressure, the community is real. So that's another thing. And the fact is that this really paves the way to another judicial system completely that is not equal. They don't see women as equal to men. There is no dayanot in the rabbinical courts by a decision, not because they didn't find any. Only men who decide on our lives as well, and it's not equal. So how can we say that this is not going towards an halachic state? And this is not something that only secular women are worried about. On the contrary, the women who will be first affected are the Haredi women and the religious women.
Does every decision have to abide by like the rights that you're granted to here, or is it just completely separate and then accepted as?
It's completely separate. And this week, MK Busso, who's from the Haredi party, wanted to expand this bill more even than it already was, and say that the rulings from the rabbinical court don't have to be approved in the civilian court, because after there is a hearing in the rabbinical court, they usually have to transfer it to the civilian court, and they have to approve it.
Oh, okay.
And now
they're trying to...
This was already approved, that this will not be part of the decision. So this is not part of the bill. So everything that will be decided in the rabbinical court is already sealed, and this is the final decision. It will not be transferred.
And won't even be reviewed.
Civilian. Yeah.
I'm like afraid to ask, but do they still have does this still adhere to like the basic laws of Israel, at least?
Why would it?
Because we like to live in this illusion that those are like, the foundational legal structures that, guarantee our rights. So
the expansion of the rabbinical court is actually undermining the democracy and the democratic values of Israel. And this is the first step of crumbling this.
So how are organizations like yours pushing back?
So we're an advocacy organization. We are there in the Knesset discussions every day, every night sometimes, highlighting why this bill is so dangerous. We work backstage and we work on social media and on traditional media to explain, because this is really a very complex idea and bill. So we have to explain to the public why this is so dangerous and why this is so complicated. And we also, we were successful in pushing this back for a long time. Mm-hmm. As MK Gafni said yesterday, this is a bill that they have been trying to promote for 20 years.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to look at it as a success, but the fact that we were able to push it for this long time says a lot. But this is not the end of it. This hasn't passed the second and third hearing in the Meliyah. And so we will fight it till the last minute. And then after that, we have other tools that we can use. Mm-hmm. As a legal advocacy organization. We also appeal to the High Supreme Court of Justice sometimes. Mm-hmm. So this is another option that we're thinking of.
To say it's very Israel-esque that, as soon as like, the war kind of starts to die down, we immediately as a country go right back into this, this like legal mess.
Exactly.
I was wondering how long would it take to, get back into it, and apparently not long is the answer.
That's true.
Another, very, very big story that I would love to, discuss and dissect and really understand the further implications is Arbel Yehoud, hostage released by Hamas in, I think it was January, February of last year. She had an interview on N12, and she bravely recounted a lot of her experiences in captivity, including physical abuse, including sexual abuse, and a lot of other very horrific details. So obviously she was not the first hostage who has come forward and has said things like this. Former hostages have come forward before and given interviews and recounted the details. I remember writing the article about Amit Sosna went to the UN and detailed her horrific events. Right. There have also been male hostages like Giboda. First, I'd like to start by saying that obviously, like every time this happens, I think it has to be commended. It's very brave to be able to go on camera and to actually say these terrible, horrific things. And I think they're really doing a huge justice by sharing a story that only they can share and only they can tell. But it does highlight this issue that kind of as a society, a huge part of Israel has now become victims. And a huge part of being a victim is your autonomy is taken from you. And as a society, this was kind of like put on us. Your organization helps women who have suffered this on a greater scale much before October 7th, but now also after October 7th. I guess like the first thing I want to know is, after the October 7th and the war, what kind of changes have you seen like in society with the people you work with, the problems you have to address, like the way that you address them, etc. Like what is like what do these problems look like today?
First of all, I totally agree. The amount of bravery it takes to just sit in front of a camera and talk about your ordeal is enormous. And the truth is that Arbel and the many women and men that you mentioned were there completely alone. They were just there alone dealing with this, pretty much abandoned with everyone. And on the first few hours, few days after October 7, we, the women's organizations in Israel, we understood pretty quickly how conflict-related sexual violence will be part of this story about this horrific massacre. Just the idea of having terrorists at the home of the kibbutzim for a long period of time and taking the hostages and being with them completely alone, it wasn't a question of if, it was a question of when and how much. So we started to reach out to NGOs from around the world, and we tried to ask questions because this wasn't part of the story, the conflict in Israel. So we reached out to the UN, and we drafted letters, and we did whatever we could. I remember traveling to Geneva to the UN with Arbel's friend who talked about her release before she was released. And we all did whatever we could to raise awareness around that. And the truth is, this wasn't the only issue that affected women during the war. So we have a women's rights center where we help women exercise their rights. They call us, they WhatsApp us, and they tell us their situation, and we tell them what they're eligible for, what kind of governmental grants they can receive. And we help them exercise these rights. We go hand by hand with them and to make sure that they receive the funds that they're eligible for.
Did these conversations around women at least shift at a point when hostages were actually returned and they kind of had to confront these issues? Or do you think today it's kind of like the same?
I think that the government knew what was going on in captivity. It wasn't something that they first heard from the hostages when they returned. They knew what was going on. And it's kind of, it's a weird balance because these government ministries went on to the UN stage and talked about what's happening before the hostages came back.
Right.
They talked about sexual violence. They talked about rape. But nobody talked to us Israelis about it. It felt like they're talking over our heads. When we try to reach out and say, there are so many videos, we have collected them, we started an archive, we want to tell you what we know, there was no one to talk to. But on the other hand, they were talking about it, just not with Israel, internationally. So that was very difficult for us. And now, where we're after 2 years of the war, when the hostages return, this is just one part of this whole story. I think that women's needs, stories, and voices are just not part of policies.
What kind of committee or infrastructure or resources would you like to see in place so that, I don't want to say when, but if Israel gets into another war, these issues don't resurface, or at least heavily mitigated, or at least there's some kind of outlet to streamline the solution so that this doesn't kind of get lost between the cracks?
So first of all, we have to learn from our mistakes. This is like the first step of, I don't know, every parent who teaches their child how to grow from something.
Yeah.
So we have to understand what we did wrong and to change and do something differently. So talking about sexual violence, this has to be taken into consideration as a way of targeting us as in war, and
Yeah.
the next war, if we're talking about that. And now it's not part of the story. It's not part of the MOs that they're talking about, how the IDF should react, what should diplomacy do in these sorts of situations. Nobody knew, and I don't think that they created a vast knowledge base around that now. And this goes out to the labor market, because we see how the labor market was affected during the war. Many women who are parents and mothers had to decrease the numbers of hours and were really affected by that. Many women had to extend their maternity leave because their husbands was in reserve.
Right.
And now they're just like 2 years after, they're looking for themselves in the employment market, where they have this huge gap in their CV, and they're all alone. But this is not her problem specifically, like personally. This is a national
Societal,
problem. So if we want to grow from this, if we want mothers to go back to the labor market, we have to help them, we have to promote them, we have to give them an opportunity to go back in a different way. So I think there are so many steps that we can do towards learning how we can do things differently. In the Iran attack, they shut down everything completely. The educational centers were shut down.
Yeah.
Employment places, just like workplaces, said don't come to work, and nobody talked about the reimbursement of people in general. Yeah. So for a long time, employers didn't know how they will be able to pay the salaries of that month. But why were we not prepared? Like, this wasn't October 7. We knew that maybe this could be part of the future. Why nobody's talking about it now? If there will be another attack, which God forbid, I hope not, but if there will be, there is no good solution around that, how the government will reimburse the employers that will be able to pay salaries. So there's so many questions around that nobody had the time to sit down and solve this. And it's not because there was no time. It's because
we initiated the attack, so we knew it was coming too.
Exactly. Nobody's interested in solving problems, not in the Knesset and not in the government in these days. And it's terrible, but we're all affected by it.
Obviously, there's a lot of structural issues from the government, like from the top down. I wonder, like, what kind of changes through your work have you seen kind of like societally? As in, this is like anecdotally, it's not from any studies or anything, but I feel that since October 7th, a lot of issues about like mental health are more in the public eye. They're more easily accepted because it was kind of a taboo to talk about before, at least it felt like, and now the whole country has PTSD and all of a sudden it's fine. If any of that's shifted onto women's issues, because if we think about, the hostages who have come forward and speak out, and I've spoken out, obviously it's very difficult for them to come forward, but one thing that I think is great for them is that they essentially have, the whole country behind them. They have a good support network that, a lot of women, when they face these issues, they don't. They're alone. They feel kind of duress in the other direction, kind of not to express their issues. So is that something that's being recognized more today in Israel?
I think some of the issues have been like more in the public eye. I think the entire story around reserve families has been more talked about the burden that women, mothers carry during this time when their husbands are 200, 500 days in reserve. The ex-wives of reserve is an appeal to the High Supreme Court of Justice we're leading right now. We're talking about roughly 10,000 women who are in this position. This is a more complicated topic because nobody likes to talk about divorces.
Of course.
But when we ask women how they were affected by war, they talk about their marital relationship, how the family was affected, how their employment situation was affected, and how the sense of security, a very personal sense of security, was defected. And I think these are very basic bricks
Yeah.
of how I wake up in the morning and how I have the strength to do what I do. Not me specifically, but everyone. So to understand that many of regular and normative homes in Israel are now starting to crumble, and how the employment market is just on the brink of collapsing as well. This all affects everything, and everything affects this. I think the conversation around women's needs is not talked about enough. We can have speculations about why this is the case. I think this was the case prior to October 7, and we feel just because now more of the crisis and how the situation has become worse.
Yeah.
But we have been, the IWN has been advocating for women's rights for the past 40 years. We have been, and we've seen many waves of things that have happened. And we are now much more concerned about the way that rehabilitation will look like in Israel, and how there are pretty much no women around the table and nobody to speak our minds and our voices.
Yeah. So I guess the ultimate question here is that when people like Arbel Yehoud, like all the other hostages, and I'm almost like, it's sad to say this, but I'm sure she's not going to be the last hostage to come forward and tell these stories.
I'm sure.
Unfortunately, there's probably going to be more. The question here is that while it shouldn't rely on them, is their coming forward going to be able to actually move the needle on some of these issues so they could actually properly be addressed or at least acknowledged, or does Israel kind of still have way more of a way to go?
I think this is a process that will take a long time, talking about years and maybe more than that. And I think it's totally understandable if Arbel Yehoud and other women like her and men will decide not to speak more about it. So we don't need them to acknowledge what happened. And if then other people are not willing to listen to what was already said, then we don't need other stories to explain of what happened on October 7 and what happened during the captivity time. I think that what I'm interested in is how the recovery process will look for them. I hope that Arbel and Ariel, which they are a wonderful couple, and the fact that they really had the bravery to sit down in front of the camera and to talk about what they're dealing with right now is really complicated. And I really hope that they will be able to build a home, as they said, and to live among the people that stood with their signs even though they didn't know them at the hostage square. I think this is what we should focus on. How in times of crisis we were together, and we weren't there just because we knew them. We were, and we went to the hostage square every Saturday night to support and to ask for their release. And now I'm just interested to see how they will be able to recover. And also, I think the question is what the government is doing to support them, which, as Ariel said himself in the article, that it's not enough. The money and the support that they're receiving is not enough. And to go through this for 2 years, they have to have an amazing support system, and the government has to step in. The government can still change its decision and expand the number of funds that they have allocated to this story, because we know that there are funds. Okay, it's not
Yeah.
like it's just the decision of priorities. So I hope this story and maybe other stories as well will be able to put more pressure on the government to do that.
I don't expect a lot of changes to be done in the next few months because, as we all know, elections are coming up.
Right.
So, the powers that be currently don't really want to make too bold of changes until maybe after the elections. And once, movements are secured and whatnot, then I think actual change could be made. So I don't expect to see anything immediate, but regardless of the results of the elections, after they're done, when this change is going to come through, it's clear that, I think the motivation to do so isn't going to come from the top down. It's going to have to come from, like voices like yours and your organizations.
Exactly. And I have to say, I'm sorry,
Yeah, of course.
that elections is time to hold our politicians accountable. Every politician should work for us, for our behalf. And we can't accept the fact that they're not working for us.
Right.
So we have to ask difficult questions, and we have to make sure that they know what we need and we know what we want. IWN is promoting surveys and showing what women needs are on the table and what voices of women are asking for in this difficult time. And I think this is we can't accept this situation when the politicians are not working for us. And the election time is the best way to start talking about this and to hold them accountable for women's needs, democracy, and everything that is just the base of this Israel state.
Yeah. Leading up to elections, let's say if I wanted to inform myself more specifically about these issues, because conceptually I can understand, okay, my husband's in Miluim, so it's harder for me in these different ways. But if someone really listening to this really wants to understand the full scope and the nitty-gritty details of these kinds of issues, how would you recommend, what should someone look into?
So first of all, come on our website, Israel Women's Network, IWN. We write mostly in Hebrew, but we do write in English, and we talk about how women are affected by on multiple levels. We will be so happy to start a conversation with anyone around that. I think this is starting a conversation and asking the questions. This is the first step of understanding what's happening. So we even see how the media has affected the trajectory of policies if they ask the right questions.
Right.
So this is another thing that we're doing, and as a reader, as someone who works everywhere, we can ask these questions. So I think this is very important, and to hold people accountable, to ask difficult questions. Sometimes we're used to be brought up to the idea that it's not really comfortable to ask difficult questions, and maybe we should be more polite and stuff like that. But these days are over. We have to make sure that someone is working for us, and nobody will do that work for us.
I see. So as the media, what I'll give you the platform. What do you think are one or two difficult questions? You don't even necessarily have to answer, but what do you think are some difficult questions that people should be asking and looking into and considering that maybe they weren't really willing to consider before?
So when we look at appointments and high positions in civil service, I think it's very important to ask, how is it that there are no women in the Treasury Department, the Treasury Ministry in Israel? How is it possible that they didn't find good women? We are in 2026. Obviously, this answer is uneligible.
Yeah. Statistically, it wouldn't. Yeah.
Statistically, definitely. So when the media starts asking these questions, asking why don't you appoint women? There are so many qualified women for this position. Why are you promoting a bill that will affect and harm women? Why are you not saying the truth about this? And we can talk about so many bills around this. So when we start asking these questions and we raise awareness to that, we're talking to the public, but we're also talking to the politicians.
Yeah.
And they are being cornered to a position where they don't have good answers to say. And, even just talking about topics, the fact that we're talking about women's issues and how women are affected by the war, I think that this is a huge platform, and talking about that, this is really important. So every listener who maybe didn't think about that wasn't the main issue that he or she were looking for in a podcast. And now they're starting to connect the dots between how the war and how women were affecting each other. Then I think this is a huge first step.
What do you think is like the crucial first step that people can do now, whether it be educating themselves or asking questions or whatever? What is like the starting point that people should start doing like right now?
So two things. First is understanding that everyone has the power to change the reality. And I know it sounds like big, but we have to believe that in order to do what we do. So it's either to connect with IWN or to connect with other organizations who you believe in their work and support them, and then be informed, like have your agency to understand what your rights are, what you're eligible for, what the government should do for you and has to do for you. Then you will be able to take the next step, which is demanding these rights. So first of all, you have to receive knowledge and read and learn and understand, and then you have to collaborate with other organizations who already do the same work. And we want to support you. We do this not because of the salaries. We do this because we believe this is the most crucial thing to do. To protect women's rights in Israel is to protect Israel's democracy and to protect the future of Israel entirely.
Right. Well, I hope this inspires people to read the proper materials. Great. Thank you so much for joining and sharing your insights.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And now, for a more in-depth look at the incident in Bnei Brak and discerning if this was just a fringe incident or a norm, we're joined by Rabbi Natan Slifkin. Rabbi, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
For starters, can you just introduce yourself briefly, tell viewers who you are?
My name is Natan Slifkin, originally from England. Been living in Israel for the last 32 years. My day job is running the Biblical Museum of Natural History next to Bet Shemesh. But by night, I write a blog called Rationalist Judaism, which started out dealing with issues of Torah and science, but evolved to dealing with issues of Torah and society in Israel, and in particular, a focus on Haredi and ultra-Orthodox society, which I used to be part of. And now I'm part of the religious Zionist community, and which I think is what led you to want to interview me today.
So to fill our viewers in, obviously one of the top stories of this week that that made headlines everywhere, still being discussed today, is of course the incident where ultra-Orthodox Haredim chased and attacked female soldiers in Bnei Brak. There was a lot of protests that followed. There was a lot of rioting that followed afterwards. We saw later on in the day that some of the soldiers had to be kind of escorted from Tel Aviv to Petach Tikva because they couldn't ride buses near there. And obviously this was followed with, political reactions, people making statements, etc. But, there's this insight into the community and, these kind of events that, we're trying to get and really understand. So I think the first question here is this an isolated incident that doesn't really represent what happens when female soldiers go near these communities, or is this something that is kind of a norm?
Well, you're presenting two possibilities, and I want to just refine it a bit. It's definitely not an isolated incident. I mean, it's the kind of thing that happens frequently in Bnei Brak, in Jerusalem, in Bet Shemesh, where I live. It's certainly not the majority of the Haredi community engaging in these attacks. It's not the majority of the community, but it is a very substantial minority. And more to the point, even though the majority of the community do not violently riot, but nevertheless, the phenomenon that exists is an outgrowth of the community. It's an extreme manifestation of a phenomenon of modern Haredi society, which is the complete isolation from the rest of Israel, seeing the government, the state institutions as being that of a different nation, and now effectively an enemy nation, and therefore soldiers and police officers are the agents of that enemy nation who are trying to, uproot your Judaism.
Following up to that, the question has to be asked is, what was the significance of the injured officers being women? does this represent like a more,
I saw one Haredi commenter write, "Oh, they shouldn't have sent women. They should have known that was a bad situation." What do you mean? If they'd have sent men, the response would have been the same. It's not like they were attacked for being women. It's more of a horrifying scene for us to watch. But male soldiers, police officers also get attacked by extremists in Haredi communities.
First of all, as things stand now, there's this kind of like pointing of fingers and different versions going on around saying that they were doing a home visit to a soldier. Some people are saying they were distributing flyers to draft to the army. Assuming they were distributing flyers, does that anyway make this a different case than things when these usually happen, or does it not actually really matter what they're going to do? Like, would this have happened anyway?
I think I've seen those kinds of arguments, and it's really insignificant. And if they were distributing flyers, so what? So that legitimizes it? Of course not. I think that there's two issues we have to realize going on here. Two problems. One is the problem of Haredi society. Well, three problems. The problem that everyone's talking about is this violent mob. But like I say, that is something which is not reflective of what most of Haredi society would do. The bigger problem is what it emerges from, which is how all of Haredi society is, not serving in the IDF, don't see themselves as having civic obligations to the state because they see the state as a foreign oppressor. But of course, the other aspect, of course, is from the non-Haredi side of things, the fact that Israel has effectively lost sovereignty in Jewish cities, in Bnei Brak, in parts of Jerusalem, in Beit Shemesh. People talk about how in England, where I'm from, about how there are areas that are no-go zones for the police. Well, it's effectively what we have in Israel, where Israel does not have control over these areas, which is obviously a very big problem.
When these incidents happen, and if it's not an isolated incident, do you think Haredi leadership is doing enough or anything at all to try to contain these incidents or make sure that this kind of stuff doesn't happen, or do you think it kind of gets unaddressed?
With the essays incident, so the two leaders of the Haredi world, with Dov Landau and Moshe Hillel Hirsch, put out a letter, condemning the violence. But first of all, the letter itself, if you read it carefully, it's talking about how it's dangerous and gives as a Chilul Hashem, gives the Haredi community a bad name. Dangerous and a PR disaster are not quite the same as saying that it's inherently wrong. And the other point is, as much as they don't agree with this kind of violence, but it's the inevitable result. Again, when you create a community in which the government, the rest of Israel is a different nation, and there's no civic obligations, and you don't feel part of it, and the whole idea is to be separate and different. And then when the government is trying to enlist, trying to solve the IDF manpower problem, it's like, they don't care because it's not our problem. So the inevitable result is it's going to lead to conflict, and it will lead to violent conflict.
Given, the realities and the mentality of this, opposite state that you're not part of, what should Israeli leadership do? As in, do they kind of capitulate to this and give them their autonomy and stop sending soldiers near the area for fear of incidents like this breaking out? Does leadership need to crack down harder? What needs to be done from Israel's side if it's not coming from the Haredi leadership?
Well, it's kind of, evolved into this huge, monster that's being created, which is not easy to solve. And if we're talking about a few tiny communities, then we'd have the luxury of saying, okay, ignore it, that's our limitations. But you're talking about a gigantic population, which is now approached close to a third of first graders. So obviously, the state itself cannot survive. Right? The state cannot survive when it's a third of the adult population who doesn't want to economically contribute, wants to be economically supported, and doesn't want to serve in the IDF. It's the end of Israel. So it is something that has to be tackled. And unfortunately, because this problem has been allowed to fester and grow, because for every government, it was always more convenient to give the Haredim a blanket deferral. It started with Menachem Begin. Right? In the early decades of the state, there were only 800 exemptions from IDF service. And whoever wasn't part of that maximum of 800 in the Haredi community, they served in the army and they worked and they contributed to the economy. Then Begin he took off the cap of 800, ballooned into 80,000. And it was always convenient for every government to just, yes, give them the exemption, throw money at them in exchange for votes. And now we've got into a situation which is very, very hard to solve. You have this gigantic community that does not see itself as part of Israel and that will violently resist being made to be part of Israel, the extremists among it. So it is not going to be pleasant or easy to resolve, but it's something that, again, you either tackle it now or it festers and becomes a bigger problem. Just like, with our external enemies. You let problems fester and grow, you're just kicking the can down the road for a bigger confrontation further down the line. But there are ways to solve it. For example, arresting yeshiva students for draft evasion isn't necessarily the smartest way to go about it. There's a simpler solution is, you cut various financial benefits, suspend driver's licenses, things like that. And it's not going to bring all 80,000 Haredim into the army, but it would bring 10, 20, 30,000 in. And then already the whole situation would look completely different.
Yeah, and like the topic of sanctions on the Haredi community is it's very much in political deadlock right now. But like from the Haredi leadership, even if their condemnation against the incident might be for the wrong reasons, as in PR and not because of the egregious incident, nevertheless, if they for one reason or another think that the attack is bad, what practical steps would you like to see from a Haredi leadership that would reduce confrontation with like the state and authorities without, depending on a draft law and sanctions and like more complicated things to pass?
Again, it's hard to see what they can do because you can't have it both ways. When you present a whole narrative, a whole worldview in which they're not part of the state and they don't have to materially support the state and the state has to materially support them, then it's going to lead to confrontation when the state finally needs to, demand civic obligations. And then saying, oh, but we don't want it to be violent, but you've created this conflict, right? And again, there's very little the Haredi leadership can do at this point. Really, the onus is on everyone else. I mean, of course, the Haredi leadership should be saying it's time to change and so on, but it's not going to happen. We can't expect that that's going to happen. The leadership is very stuck in its ways. It's weak. It's not going to change. What the rest of Israel needs to do is to recognize that this is an existential threat, just like we have other existential threats, and it has to be dealt with now. And that means that the politicians, have to realize that, for example, passing this draft evasion law, so-called draft law, really a draft evasion law, which hardly is going to make anyone in the list, if anyone, and frees up billions of shekels to further enable this lifestyle. It's just, again, it's kicking the can down the road. It's going to make this problem just grow and grow and grow. And it's very politically expedient, for people who want the government to stay in power for another couple of months to do this, to try and ram this law through. But it's just something that's going to blow up in our faces further down the line.
So obviously, this all kind of boils down to actually addressing the problem and actually solving it rather than putting on Band-Aids.
Exactly.
That being said,
thanks to what you said. So Boaz Bismarck, who's the Likud MK who's drafting this exemption law, he said about how yesterday's event in Bnei Brak shows the importance of reaching an arrangement with the Haredim that will quieten things down. What's that? That's like, lahavdil. Not to compare, but that's like the arrangement with Hamas. Right? You make an arrangement to placate people who are fundamentally different worldview than you, to bribe them, to placate them. You're not solving the core problem. Again, not to compare, but just the idea.
Yeah. Just want to clarify that so that
placating is not solving a problem.
The ultimate question that's on everyone's mind is that is there really a, if you put political considerations aside for a sec, is there actually like a practical, effective way to combine, Torah study and civic responsibility in a way that will meet the state's needs and also allow Haredim to, fulfill their worldview, not in a way that just punishes them, but also gives them a carrot?
Well, my son is in yeshiva and serves in the IDF, right? Part of the Hester program that combines combat army service with years of yeshiva learning. And that's a Dati Leumi Hester Yeshiva, one of over 80 such institutions. And in the Haredi world, they exist also. There are Haredi army frameworks, Chashmonaim, and so on. which are perfectly satisfactory spiritual frameworks. And again, but this whole mentality has to change. It can't be that, if we're not 100% happy with this framework, then we're not going to serve. It doesn't work that way. When you have a civic obligation, you don't get to say, well, I don't want it. This isn't exactly how it suits me, so everyone else is going to have to pay the price and not me. It needs to change the mentality. The mentality has to be civic duty. Just because maybe the tax authority sometimes doesn't act appropriately doesn't mean you get to say, well, my community isn't going to pay taxes. So the frameworks are there. The frameworks are there. The Haredi frameworks are there. Is it possible to enlist all 80,000 Haredim? No, of course not. But it is possible by cutting the funding to get 20, 30,000, which would solve the IDF manpower shortage. It would mean the reservists don't need to spend 3 months in reserve duty at a minimum every year for the next decades. And you'd solve the IDF manpower shortage, and even those who you don't manage to get into enlist, at least there's no reason why the state should be funding them. There's no reason why the state should be spending billions funding this lifestyle.
Since we can't actually put, political considerations aside, and I at least don't predict that this change in worldview will come from the top down. I'd love to know, from your end, as like an ex-Haredi person, how did that change in worldview come about in you, and what clicked for you, and what do you think are things that could happen from the ground up that would at least allow, the average Haredi person, not necessarily, either the leadership or people who reside in this minority to look at things differently?
Well, my personal example may not be representative. I read a bunch of books 20 years ago in Torah and Science, which received kind of a hostile reception, to put it mildly, in the Haredi community, which is when I realized that it probably wasn't for me. But separately, living in Ramat Shemesh, seeing a lot of the political conflict and that went on, that was also something that made me realize that there were problems with the Haredi community. But change happens, they say it's the same, necessity is the mother of invention. And the same is true for theology. Necessity is the mother of theological reinvention. In the diaspora, in America, in the UK, right, Haredim work, and there's an ideology that you work because you have to, right? Again, in Israel, the community has been spoiled with having money thrown at them in exchange for political support. But once it becomes clear that that political support is toxic, and its lifestyle is toxic to support, once the money gets cut off, then the ideology will change, because it will have to. And it will become accepted, and many people will go to the army because they need to, because they want to avoid either sanctions, losing their driver's license, or financially. And once some people do it, it becomes sociologically acceptable, right? As opposed to now, where it's just sociologically just unthinkable to go to the army. And work too. Once you become not being funded to be in Kollel, and people will have to work, and they'll have to get an education, and the ideology will change to suit. We'll go back to the classical Jewish values, right? I mean, this whole phenomenon of mass Kollel is a completely modern phenomenon. Right? The Talmud speaks about the importance of being economically independent, speaks about the importance of raising your children to work for a living. And that's how it was for most of Jewish history. It only changed relatively recently with the welfare state that indulged a lifestyle of dependency. If you cut that indulgence off, they will be forced to revert to what traditionally Judaism was. Now, that change is very difficult, and it's going to be very painful. And you could say, well, it's unfair, because they were indulged them for so long, how can you expect them to change? And for that's really the leadership's fault, because already, as soon as October 7th happened, the writing was on the wall then that this is unsustainable, this cannot continue. And it's been over 2 years, but they could have said, okay, it's time, we need to change the way this society works. And they didn't take that opportunity, even after seeing all the rest of the suffering Israel was undergoing. So now, if you don't do it the easy way, it's going to have to be the hard way.
And so obviously, to address the elephant in the room, like you said, elections are coming up, and there kind of is an incentive to kick things down the road until afterwards, and then maybe, partially address them. That being said, obviously, the ideal solution would actually be passing some kind of legislation that really answers the problem. But as we said, it's in deadlock. It looks like it's not really on the docket anytime soon. So on the less extreme levels, and I don't want to use words like appeasement, but at the same time, the reality that the options are solve this problem once and for all or keep having incidents like this is kind of like a tough reality to grapple with. So I think, like, despite all of these factors and everything we just said, is there even anything that can be done, at least just to, like, I don't want to say like turn down the temperature, but just to make sure that like incidents like this would become fringe incidents? Or we actually is the only thing we could do just to really like root out and solve the problem?
Look, it would be nice to say, to think that there's some kind of simple, straightforward measures that can be done, but they just aren't. Many people have tried for years to try things, to try bridge building. People have opened like new programs, right? Haredi state schools, with a core curriculum, and there's amazing people who've done amazing things. But you're talking about a drop in the ocean, right? And people talk about Haredim integrating into society, into the schools or special college programs, and it is happening, but it's happening glacially slowly, and it's such a tiny proportion of the overall population that's just not going to be anywhere near enough to stop societal collapse. And if the average Haredi family has 6 kids and 1 or even 2 of them becomes integrated into society, that's still 4 or 5 that do not. And you're talking about an exponential growth rate. So if it's not too late, I think this really may be where the last chance is before the Haredi community becomes so politically powerful that it becomes impossible to put them in the opposition. So I don't think it can be stressed enough, how important it is that needs to be acted now. Otherwise, we're talking about something that is a genuine existential threat to the survival of Israel. Israel cannot survive in this part of the world against so many hostile enemies without a strong army and a strong economy. And that requires a population which is civic-minded, which contributes to the economy, which contributes to national defense. And the percentage of the population that's doing that is steadily decreasing, and that's got to change.
We have these two extremes, kind of, which is, I don't want to say extremes, but like extreme scenarios in which one is we solve the issue, we pass a effective Haredi draft law, contribution to society, worldview changes, and then the other side is half the society doesn't want to contribute to the state, and Israel is like existentially weakened, and we're in a big security threat. But in the more immediate term, when I look at incidents like this, and I look at how they happen, and I look at the response from the leadership, both the Haredi leadership and also from the government, and very lackluster messaging, and I worry, as the push for a draft bill becomes stronger, are there going to be more incidents like this more frequently, and is it going to boil over into something very bad? Is that something that could happen in the near future?
For sure. We can only anticipate this to increase because, as you force a society to take its obligations seriously, so that sector of the society which doesn't want to take these obligations is going to react very strongly. It's going to get a lot harder before it gets easier. Again, you got 2 choices. You can either, you back off, which is what the government wants to do, just like totally back off and let them be, and buy peace and quiet. But then, you're creating a situation which down the road is going to be catastrophic. Or you tackle it head on, which is going to be very hard, and it's going to lead to conflict. There's going to be terrible incidents. But that's what if there's one lesson that we should have learned over the last few years, it's that you don't kick the can down the road.
Yeah, I really appreciate your insights into the community and your thoughts on the solution and how things are being done and what are being done, and we can just hope that the leadership starts to message in the right direction.
Yep, let's hope.
Thank you for joining us for another episode. We hope that you've all learned something and are maybe inspired to ask some difficult questions. We'll be back in the same place next week, but until then, make sure to stay up to date for the latest in Israel at jpost.com.